Within the next 12 months, the UK tax system could experience a collapse so profound that it rewrites the social contract between citizen and state. And the title of this investigation asks a question that most officials refuse to answer honestly. Is the UK tax system collapsing? What you're about to hear is not speculation. It's a detailed examination of structural fractures that are widening by the day, and the evidence suggests that Britain's revenue apparatus is entering a crisis phase that will touch every person in this country, whether you pay taxes or depend on the services they fund. The system that has sustained the welfare state, the NHS, pensions, schools, defence, and infrastructure for generations, is now buckling under pressures that compound faster than politicians can acknowledge. And the consequences of this collapse will redefine what it means to live in the United Kingdom. The first crack appeared not in a single catastrophic event, but in the slow accumulation of unsustainable promises. For decades, successive governments have expanded state commitments while the tax base has remained static or even contracted in real terms. Andrew Bailey at the Bank of England has warned repeatedly about fiscal sustainability, though his language has been carefully diplomatic. But the numbers tell a story that diplomacy cannot soften. The Office for Budget Responsibility published projections in late 2024 showing that even under optimistic growth scenarios, the gap between committed spending and realistic revenue is widening at an accelerating rate. And this gap is not something that can be closed with minor adjustments or efficiency savings. The OBR's own analysts, speaking off the record, have described the trajectory as a fiscal event horizon, a point beyond which normal policy tools lose their effectiveness, and Britain is approaching that horizon faster than the public realises. Consider what has happened to the tax base itself. Corporation tax revenues, once a reliable pillar, have become volatile and vulnerable. Jeremy Hunt implemented headline rate increases, but the effective tax paid by large corporations has not risen proportionally because of reliefs, allowances, international structuring, and the simple reality that capital is mobile in ways that labour is not. A senior tax barrister in London, someone who advises FTSE 100 companies, told colleagues at a private dinner that the current system is held together by goodwill and fear of reputational damage, not by effective enforcement, and the goodwill is eroding as companies watch the state struggle to provide basic services while demanding ever more revenue. Meanwhile, income tax and national insurance, the backbone of the system, are straining under demographic and economic pressures that were predictable but never properly addressed. The population is ageing, the workforce participation rate among prime age workers has declined since the pandemic, and productivity growth has stalled, which means fewer people are generating the income that funds everything else. Then there is the compliance crisis, a term that officials hate but use in closed-door meetings. HMRC, the body responsible for collecting taxes, has been hollowed out by years of budget cuts, staff reductions, and failed IT modernisation projects that consume billions without delivering functional systems. The department lost over 40,000 staff between 2005 and 2023. And while digital services were supposed to compensate, the reality is that the tax authority can no longer effectively audit, investigate, or even answer phone calls from taxpayers seeking basic guidance. A former HMRC compliance officer, now working in the private sector, described the situation as institutional collapse in slow motion, where the appearance of function masks a reality in which vast swathes of economic activity simply go unmonitored. The tax gap, the difference between what should be collected and what actually is, officially stands at around £30 billion annually. But independent estimates from tax justice researchers put the real figure closer to $90 billion when you include avoidance, evasion, and uncollected debts. That missing revenue is larger than the entire defence budget, and it represents money that was supposed to pay for hospitals, schools, and pensions, but instead remains in the hands of those who have found ways around the system. The political response has been to raise rates on those who cannot avoid paying, which means employees, small businesses, and pensioners. Rishi Sunak's government froze income tax thresholds, a move that drags millions of people into higher brackets as wages rise with inflation. And Keir Starmer's administration has continued this policy while adding new levies on capital gains, inheritance, and employer national insurance contributions. These measures generate headlines about fairness and ask the wealthy to pay their share. But the reality is that the truly wealthy have options, structures, trusts, offshore arrangements, and professional advisors, while the modestly successful, the small business owner, the dual income professional household, the pensioner who saved diligently, these are the people who bear the brunt. A GP in Manchester recently calculated that after income tax, national insurance, student loan repayments, pension contributions, and the effective marginal rate created by lost allowances, her take-home pay on earnings above a certain threshold was less than 40%. And this is not an extreme case. It is increasingly the norm for anyone in the higher rate band. The psychological impact of this is profound. People are making rational decisions to work less, to avoid earning more, to retire early, or to leave the country. And each of those decisions shrinks the tax base further. At the same time, the spending side of the equation is exploding in ways that cannot be controlled through normal political processes. The NHS, which consumes more than a quarter of all government spending, requires annual increases that far exceed inflation just to maintain current service levels, and those levels are already widely acknowledged to be inadequate. The waiting lists, the staff shortages, the crumbling infrastructure. These are not temporary problems that will resolve with better management. They are symptoms of a system that needs exponentially more resources every year, while the population it serves grows older and sicker. A health economist at the London School of Economics recently modelled the trajectory and concluded that under current policies, the NHS will consume 40% of all government spending by 2040, which would require either doubling the overall tax burden or abandoning most other state functions, and neither option is politically or economically viable. The same dynamic applies to pensions, where the state pension age keeps rising but longevity keeps improving, and the ratio of workers to pensioners keeps falling, and to social care, which is already rationed to the point of inhumanity and will only worsen as the demographic wave crests in the next decade. The debt situation compounds everything because Britain is now spending over £100 billion annually just on interest payments, more than the education budget, and those payments are sensitive to interest rates that remain elevated and unlikely to fall significantly. Larry Fink of BlackRock has been clear in his assessments of sovereign debt sustainability. And while he speaks diplomatically about the UK, his firm's internal risk models reportedly flag British gilts as entering a higher risk category, which means that the cost of borrowing could rise not because of policy choices, but because global investors demand higher compensation for the risk of holding UK debt. The Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee is trapped. Inflation remains persistent and above target, which would normally require higher rates, but higher rates make the debt burden worse and increase the risk of recession, which would collapse tax revenues even further. Andrew Bailey has described this as navigating between Scylla and Charybdis, but the reality is that both monsters are already upon us, and the ship is taking on water. What happens when a tax system collapses? It does not happen overnight with a dramatic announcement. It happens gradually and then suddenly, as services deteriorate, as compliance falls, as the social contract frays, and as those with options begin to exit. A family in Surrey, comfortable but not wealthy, both parents working professional jobs, recently sat down with a financial advisor and realised that between taxes, housing costs, childcare, and basic expenses, they were effectively running at a loss. Their net worth declining every year despite good incomes, and they are now actively planning to relocate to Ireland or Portugal, places where the tax burden is lower and the quality of life higher. They are not alone. Emigration among high earners has been rising steadily, and each departure removes not just current tax revenue but future revenue, because these are people in their 30s and 40s who would have paid taxes for another 30 years. A senior partner at a London law firm said privately that half his peers are either already non-domiciled for tax purposes or planning to establish residency elsewhere. And these are people who until recently considered themselves patriotic Britons with deep roots in the country. But patriotism has limits when it means working half the year for a state that provides diminishing value in return. The political class is aware of the crisis but paralysed by short term electoral calculations. Keir Starmer's government came to power promising to fix public services without raising taxes on working people. But that promise is mathematically impossible, and the contradictions are already visible. The autumn budget of 2024 raised employer national insurance contributions, which is technically not a tax on workers, but functions as one because it reduces hiring, suppresses wages, and makes British labour more expensive relative to competitors. Business groups reacted with fury. The CBI and British Chambers of Commerce both warned that the measure would lead to job losses and business closures, and within weeks, major retailers and hospitality firms announced restructuring plans that included thousands of redundancies. A restaurant owner in Bristol, someone who employs 30 people and has run a successful business for 15 years, calculated that the new Nike's burden would cost her an additional £60,000 annually. And she cannot raise prices enough to cover that without losing customers. So she's planning to close one location and reduce staff at the others. And she is not unusual. She is typical. Multiply her story by tens of thousands and you see how a tax increase intended to raise revenue actually destroys the businesses and jobs that generate revenue, shrinking the base it was meant to expand. The informal economy is growing, a phenomenon that economists track through indirect measures because, by definition, it does not show up in official statistics. Cash transactions are rising, barter systems are reappearing, people are working off the books, and not because they are criminals, but because the formal system has become so burdensome that participation feels like a losing proposition. A builder in Leeds explained that he now does about half his work for cash because his customers cannot afford the VAT and he cannot afford the compliance costs and tax burden of running everything through his company. And he feels guilty about it, but also resentful that the state treats people like him as revenue sources to be squeezed rather than citizens to be served. This sentiment is spreading. The sense that the tax system has become predatory rather than reciprocal. And once that belief takes hold, voluntary compliance collapses, and no amount of enforcement can compensate because HMRC does not have the resources to chase down millions of small transactions. International comparisons make the situation starker. Ireland, with a corporate tax rate that is competitive and a system that is relatively simple, attracts businesses and talent that might otherwise locate in Britain. Singapore, Dubai, and Switzerland offer even more favourable regimes. And while critics dismiss these as tax havens, the reality is that they are functioning states with high-quality infrastructure and services. They have simply made different choices about the size and scope of government. A tech entrepreneur who moved his company from London to Dublin said the difference was night and day, not just in tax rates, but in government competence, ease of doing business, and quality of life. And he now advises other founders to do the same. The brain drain is real, and it is accelerating, and each departure makes the problem worse for those who remain because the tax burden must be spread across a shrinking base of productive people. The political options are narrowing. Raising taxes further is economically counterproductive and politically toxic. Cutting spending meaningfully would require abandoning commitments that millions of people depend on, and borrowing more pushes Britain closer to a debt crisis that would make the 2022 mini-budget turmoil look like a minor tremor. Some economists have begun to speak quietly about the need for a fundamental reset, a term that means different things to different people, but generally involves some combination of debt restructuring, currency devaluation, or a radical simplification of the tax code, coupled with deep cuts to the state. None of these options is politically viable under normal circumstances, but circumstances are not normal and are becoming less so with each passing month. Kristalina Georgieva at the IMF has been careful in her public statements about the UK, but the fund's internal assessments are less diplomatic, and there have been preliminary discussions about the conditions that might be attached to a future support program if Britain were to request one, and those conditions would be severe. They would involve loss of fiscal sovereignty, imposed austerity, and structural reforms that no government could survive implementing voluntarily. Consider what this means for ordinary people trying to plan their lives. A nurse in Newcastle, someone who has worked in the NHS for 20 years, looks at her pension projections and realizes that the numbers do not add up. The contributions she has made and the promises she was given do not match the reality of what the state will be able to pay when she retires. She is not wrong to worry. Public sector pensions are unfunded liabilities that depend on future taxpayers being willing and able to honour commitments made decades ago. And if the tax system collapses, those commitments become worthless. A young couple buying their first home are stretching to afford the mortgage, and they are doing so based on assumptions about tax reliefs, childcare support, and public services that may not exist in 5 years. A small business owner has invested everything in building a company, but the regulatory and tax environment has become so hostile that he spends more time on compliance than on serving customers, and he is beginning to think that the effort is not worth it. These are not marginal cases, they are the core of British society, and they are all making rational decisions based on a system that is failing them. The next phase will involve visible failures, not abstract fiscal metrics, but tangible breakdowns that affect daily life. HMRC is already unable to process tax returns and refunds in a timely manner, and the backlogs are growing, which means that businesses owed refunds must wait months for money that is legally theirs, creating cash flow crises that force closures. Local councils are going bankrupt at an accelerating rate. Birmingham, Nottingham, Croydon, and others have effectively declared insolvency. And when a council goes under, services disappear. Bin collections stop, libraries close, social care is cut, and residents are left to fend for themselves while still paying council tax that funds nothing. The NHS is already rationing care, not officially, but in practice. Waiting times for non-urgent treatments stretch into years, cancer patients wait months for diagnostic scans, and people die on waiting lists. And this is happening now under current funding levels. Imagine what happens when the fiscal crisis deepens and health spending must be cut, not increased. The social consequences will be profound. Crime will rise as police numbers fall and desperation spreads. Homelessness will increase as the safety net frays, and social cohesion will break down as different groups compete for shrinking resources. The international dimension cannot be ignored. Britain's tax competitiveness relative to other developed nations has been declining for years, and the recent increases have accelerated that decline. Jamie Dimon of JP Morgan, speaking at a conference in New York, noted that London is losing its appeal as a financial centre, not because of Brexit alone, but because of the cumulative burden of regulation and taxation. And his firm has been quietly shifting operations and headcount to Paris, Frankfurt, and Dublin. The financial services industry generates enormous tax revenue for Britain, directly through corporation tax and bonuses, and indirectly through the consumption and investment of highly paid workers. And if that industry contracts, the fiscal hole deepens catastrophically. Manufacturing, already a shadow of its former self, faces higher energy costs and labour costs than competitors, and the tax system offers little support for capital investment. Or innovation. A German industrialist asked why his company chose Poland over the UK for a new factory, cited lower taxes, cheaper labour, and better government support, and he was matter-of-fact about it. Britain simply no longer offers a competitive proposition. The political discourse has become detached from fiscal reality. Both major parties promise better services. Neither will admit that those services cannot be funded under any plausible tax scenario. And voters are beginning to understand that they are being lied to, not through malice, but through a shared delusion among the political class that somehow things will work out. They will not work out, not without dramatic change, and that change will either be managed and deliberate or chaotic and imposed by external forces. A former Treasury Permanent Secretary, speaking anonymously to a journalist, said that the civil service has been wargaming crisis scenarios, and that some of those scenarios involve capital controls, emergency tax measures, and suspension of normal democratic processes. And while those are extreme outcomes, the fact that they are being modelled at all indicates how serious insiders believe the situation has become. What can you do in the face of a collapsing tax system? First, understand that the state will increasingly be unable to provide the services you have relied upon, which means you must build private alternatives where possible. Health insurance, private education, personal savings for care in old age. These are no longer luxuries for the wealthy, but necessities for anyone who wants security. Second, diversify your economic exposure. Do not keep all your assets, income, or opportunities tied to the UK economy, because if the system fails, those will be trapped and devalued. Third, develop skills and networks that are portable, because geographic mobility may become essential, and those who can leave will fare better than those who cannot. Fourth, reduce your dependence on state promises, pensions, benefits, subsidies. All of these are political constructs that can be changed or eliminated, and the current trajectory suggests they will be. Fifth, build community resilience, because when state capacity fails, local networks and mutual aid become critical, and those who have invested in relationships and local institutions will weather the crisis better than isolated individuals. The title asked whether the UK tax system is collapsing, and the evidence suggests that the answer is yes. Not in a single dramatic failure, but through a grinding degradation of capacity, compliance, and legitimacy that will culminate in a fiscal crisis within the next 12 months. The warnings are there for anyone willing to see them in the OBR's projections, in the Bank of England's minutes, in the IMF's careful language, in the decisions of businesses and individuals to exit or reduce their exposure. The social contract that has sustained Britain for generations, the idea that citizens pay taxes in exchange for security, healthcare, education, and opportunity. That contract is breaking because the state can no longer deliver its side of the bargain. And once a social contract breaks, rebuilding it takes decades if it can be rebuilt at all. The clock is ticking.